This week, a mother buries her son. In these final days before that, 4 separate threads in this case all landed at once, and one of them is the young woman everyone's been arguing about for weeks, finally sitting face to face with Nolan's own mother, telling her something that doesn't fully match what everyone else has said about that afternoon. At the time this video was recorded, more than 2 weeks had passed since 18-year-old Nolan Xavier Wells disappeared from Horn Island, Mississippi, off the Mississippi Gulf Coast. And this update covers 4 things that arrived within days of each other, right around one of the hardest moments this family has faced yet. Each one worth understanding on its own before weighing what they add up to together. If you're new here, here's the short version worth knowing before we get into everything that's landed this week. Nolan went out to Horn Island on a boat with a group of friends on the 4th of July. At some point that afternoon, his friends say he chose to stay behind to keep talking to a girl named Katie, planning to catch a ride back to the mainland with someone else later. He never made it home, and his body was found in the water off the island 2 days later. Nobody has been arrested. Nobody has been charged. Before I go any further, everyone I'm naming today is either speaking publicly in an official capacity or is a private citizen who has not been accused of any crime by law enforcement. This is a summary of what's been reported by credible named outlets, plus my own reaction to it, which is opinion, not a verdict. For weeks, the FBI's role in this case had only been described in fragments, a line in one statement, a comment in another, never the full picture at once. That changed this week when the Bureau's Jackson field office released a full on-the-record statement, and the wording matters here more than usual. The statement says the FBI has assisted with certain aspects of the investigation using federal tools and partnerships that have proved valuable, but that the Jackson County Sheriff's Office is leading and will continue to lead this investigation. It describes a partnership between the two agencies built over years of working together on complex cases. It says the FBI has been supporting Jackson County from day one in the effort to find answers for the Wells family and the community. And separately, confirmed to ABC News, the Bureau said it has been working to address interstate threats received by individuals related to this matter. I think it's worth sitting with the tone of that statement for a second. It reads like a deliberate attempt to lower the temperature. Speculation about federal involvement had been filling the silence for days, some of it treating the FBI's presence as proof this case had quietly escalated into something far more serious, some of it treating it as evidence of a cover-up in progress. This statement supports neither read. It confirms real, meaningful federal involvement, digital forensics, investigative tools, partnerships, while stating plainly that Jackson County remains in charge from start to finish. The FBI is providing support, and Jackson County stays in command, and Sheriff John Ledbetter backed that up separately. Telling the Locks the FBI's involvement isn't unusual at all, since Horn Island itself sits on federal land and his office works with the Bureau regularly. It's worth understanding briefly what makes a threat a federal matter in the first place, since that phrase, interstate threats, is doing a lot of work in this case. Generally, it means someone in one state sent something threatening to someone in another, using channels like the internet that inherently cross state lines, exactly the kind of thing the FBI is built to handle. It doesn't require Nolan's death itself to be treated as a federal matter, only that somebody used those channels to threaten somebody connected to this story, which is why the FBI statement can address both areas at once without blurring them together. The threats themselves matter too. The FBI statement doesn't specify who received them or what they said, and that vagueness looks intentional and defensible. We already know some of what's out there publicly. Judge Ashley Cole, the stepmother of one of the 3 young men who traveled to Horn Island with Nolan, posted screenshots of messages she'd received, including a threat referencing an exploding package sent to her family's office, and other messages too violent and specific to repeat here. Repeating threatening language, even to condemn it, tends to spread it further rather than contain it. So what matters is simpler. Whoever sent those messages is committing a serious crime, and grief, suspicion, or public pressure over Nolan's death does not excuse threatening a judge's family or anyone else connected to this case. Treseston Shepard, one of Nolan's friends who's given multiple interviews trying to correct the public record, told ABC News separately that he and others who were on the island that day have also received threats. He said, in his own words, that he and his friends are still young adults learning this whole life thing, and that they genuinely don't understand how they're getting this much hate over something they say they did nothing wrong in at all. Something uncomfortable is worth naming here. This case has generated enormous sustained attention precisely because it's emotional, because it involves real grief and a real search for accountability, and that same emotional pull is exactly what makes threats and harassment spread so easily once a story reaches this level of visibility. I don't think most people following updates like this one, including the people watching this video right now, are the ones sending threats. But the sheer size of the audience a case like this attracts creates the conditions for a small number of people to cross a line that never should be crossed in either direction against the family asking for answers or against the friends caught up in the story. The development that reshapes this case more than anything else this week involves Katie. The young woman Nolan spoke with in his final confirmed minutes on that beach has finally been heard from directly, not through a relative's Facebook post, but face-to-face in an actual conversation with Christine Wansley herself. Christine has said plainly that what Katie told her does not match the stories she's been hearing from everyone else connected to this case so far. Katie's actual account, even now, is more specific and more limited than a lot of the online conversation about her has suggested over the past 2 weeks. According to what Christine has shared, Katie has been consistent from the beginning. She and Nolan spent time together that day and eventually parted ways. Katie got back on a boat with her own friends that afternoon, separate entirely from Nolan's group. She assumed, based on what he told her, that he was heading back to rejoin his own friend's boat. Here's the detail that actually matters most. Katie never saw Nolan get on that boat. She assumed it based on their conversation, but she did not personally witness him rejoining his friends afterward. That distinction is important, and I think it got flattened by a lot of the public conversation around this case for a simple reason. A clean, direct contradiction. One person says this happened, another person says that happened. Makes for a much more satisfying story than what's going on here. Katie isn't claiming she watched Nolan walk away and board a boat while his friends claim otherwise. She's saying he told her his plan, and she had every reason to believe he'd follow through on it. That's meaningfully different from a flat eyewitness contradiction. And I think it deserves to be treated as such rather than collapsed into the same category as a direct conflicting claim. Here's what that does to the mystery at the center of this case, though. If Katie's account is accurate, the real unanswered question isn't whether Nolan wanted to leave the island. It's what happened in the gap between him stating that intention to her and whatever came next. A gap that, as of tonight, nobody, not Katie, not the friends, not the family, has been able to account for. A meeting like this one doesn't close that gap. It narrows exactly where the gap is. I think this also reframes, at least somewhat, what critics of the friend's account have been arguing this whole time. It was never really a claim that Katie caught someone lying outright. It was a claim that two honest people can describe the exact same afternoon in ways that don't fully overlap, simply because one of them is describing what she witnessed and the other is describing an assumption built on a conversation that happened minutes before whatever came next. Both an honest assumption and an honest recollection of what Nolan told his friends can technically both be true. At slightly different moments, if something changed in the gap between them, and right now nobody watching this case from the outside knows whether anything did. The investigation itself has moved since the family's meeting with the district attorney last week, and a few new details have surfaced that we hadn't covered yet on this channel. Attorney Eric Hertz, who's leading the family's independent investigation, told reporters that his team still hadn't received the official incident report on Nolan's death by the time of that meeting, and argued that Mississippi law entitles crime victims to that report within roughly 72 hours. That specific legal claim appears to overstate what Mississippi's actual crime victims' Bill of Rights guarantees. The 72-hour window in state law applies to receiving a general packet on victims' rights and to certain compensation claim deadlines, not necessarily to the incident report itself. I think it's worth flagging that distinction honestly rather than repeating Hertz's framing as settled fact. Even while the underlying frustration, a family waiting weeks for basic documentation about their own son's death, is completely real and completely understandable regardless of which specific statute applies. A redacted incident report was eventually released in response to a public records request, and it actually fills in a detail we hadn't had confirmed before, one small enough to have been easy to overlook amid everything else in this update. According to that report, Christine last saw her son in person between 5 and 6 in the evening on July 3rd, the night before the trip. Nolan then traveled to Horn Island with his 3 friends around 10 that morning on July 4th, which lines up closely with the GPS data we covered in a previous update, showing the boat departing around 9:56. The report also shows that before she ever called the Jackson County Sheriff's Department at 12:22 in the morning on July 5th. Christine first checked with the Ocean Springs Police Department and then the Mississippi Department of Marine Resources, trying to figure out which agency was supposed to handle a report like this. That means roughly 14 hours passed between Nolan's boat leaving the dock around 9:56 that morning and Christine's first call to any agency at all. A window that includes the hours his friends have described spending searching the island and the water around it on their own before anyone official was involved. Beyond that, most of the report was redacted, meaning it confirmed a basic timeline without answering the deeper questions this family has been asking from day one. That detail about which agency to even call matters too. In the middle of realizing her son hadn't come home, Christine had to work out on her own in the middle of the night which of 3 different agencies was responsible for taking her report. Horn Island itself is federal land, only reachable by private boat with no year-round residents and no local police presence of its own, which is part of why a call about a missing person there doesn't have one obvious first stop the way a call from a house in town would. It's a reminder of how much extra work and confusion gets placed on a family in exactly the moment they can least afford it. That kind of jurisdictional maze isn't something most people ever have reason to think about until they desperately need to. It's also worth remembering just how little of that report reached the public once it was released. A records request is supposed to be a tool for transparency, and in a narrow, technical sense, it worked exactly as designed here. The agency complied. A document exists. But when nearly everything in that document beyond a basic timeline has been blacked out, the practical result confirms that a process is happening without offering much real insight into what investigators currently believe. That's not necessarily improper on the department's part, since ongoing investigations routinely withhold details that could compromise their own work, but it does explain why a family with a legal team public records requests and a direct meeting with the district attorney can still describe themselves as having more questions than answers more than 2 weeks in. Ben Crump also confirmed something during that same meeting that's worth restating plainly since it's easy to lose in everything else. He told the district attorney directly that the family wants this case investigated zealously and said, in his words, that we know in America, in the South, certain people are investigated differently, and that he shared that concern with her directly. That meeting reportedly included both Crump and Hertz alongside Christine and other family members, sitting down with District Attorney McElrath's office to press for movement on a case that, at that point, had already stretched past 2 weeks without an arrest. According to reporting on the meeting, McElrath responded that this isn't how her office operates. Both things can be true at once here, that a specific prosecutor's office intends to run a fair process, and that a family with real lived experience of how cases like this have historically gone in this region has every reason to say that concern out loud rather than assume it away. Especially in a state whose own history with cases like this one is exactly why this specific case has drawn the national attention it has. The funeral itself is what this moment is for this family underneath every one of these procedural threads. Nolan's homegoing service will be held at Centerpoint Church in Ocean Springs with visitation from 9 to 11 in the morning, followed immediately by the service. Reverend Al Sharpton, who has spoken publicly about the case in the weeks since Nolan's death, will officiate the service himself. For anyone unable to attend in person, the Griot has announced it will live stream the entire service both on its website and its YouTube channel, meaning people following this case from anywhere in the country will be able to witness it as it happens. There's a detail in how this venue got decided that's worth including because the full story is more complicated and honestly more interesting than it might first appear. The Mississippi Coast Coliseum and Convention Center's own commission voted to approve the venue for Nolan's service, meaning the offer to host the funeral there was real and came from an official public body, not just informal talk. The family ultimately chose Centerpoint Church instead, and it later came out that the proposed cost for using the Coliseum had been just over $82,000, a figure that only became public after the family had already made its decision and outrage began circulating online. The venue's executive director explained that, as a public entity owned by the county, the Coliseum is legally barred under the Mississippi Constitution from waiving or reducing that cost for any individual family, and that the price reflected the staffing, security, and production needs of an event expected to draw this much national attention. There was real public frustration when that figure came out, and I don't think that frustration is unreasonable. Whatever the legal explanation, a 5-figure price tag attached to a grieving family's funeral plans is going to land hard, regardless of which statute technically requires it. The Coliseum did respond afterward with genuine warmth, saying it supported the family's decision and would light its exterior blue for the entire month of July in Nolan's honor. Both things happened, the sticker shock and the graceful exit afterward. I think leaving either one out gives you an incomplete picture of how this specific piece of the story went. I think it's worth naming plainly what this moment means underneath everything else in this update. This is a family that has spent more than 2 weeks fighting publicly and relentlessly for basic answers about how their son died, while simultaneously being forced to plan his funeral in full public view, watched by an audience that has spent that same 2 weeks debating GPS data, contested witness accounts, and viral videos. Those two threads collide directly now, in a way that no family should ever have to navigate at the same time. The same coverage that's tracked every twist in this investigation will be present for a service that Christine has described wanting to center on celebrating who Nolan was, rather than dwelling in the suspicion and grief that have otherwise defined this story from the outside looking in. The FBI's statement, Katie's account, and the redacted incident report are all arriving in the same final days before Nolan is laid to rest, which means his family is walking into this service carrying every one of these open threads with them. Unresolved, a grand jury referral still sits somewhere in the future, waiting on an investigation that hasn't finished yet. 2 autopsies remain unfinished. A gap in Nolan's final hours still hasn't been accounted for, even now that Katie has spoken directly. Grief in this case has never gotten the chance to exist entirely on its own, separate from everything else swirling around it. That won't change once the service happens. It will just give this family a few hours explicitly set aside to try. I keep thinking about how different this week's update feels compared to where this case started. 2 weeks ago, this story was dominated almost entirely by anonymous claims, viral clips stripped of their original context, and competing secondhand accounts relayed through family members on Facebook. This week brought something different. An actual federal agency speaking on the record. A key witness finally heard from directly instead of through relatives, and enough specificity about timelines and process that at least some of the fog around this case has started to lift. None of that adds up to an answer yet, but it's a meaningfully more documented, more grounded case than it was even a few days ago, and in some ways a more honest one about exactly what it still doesn't know, which is itself a strange kind of progress for a case that's spent so long defined by exactly the opposite. What comes next in the most literal sense is this service itself. A church filling with family, coaches, and teammates. A live stream carrying that same service out to strangers across the country who have followed every twist of this case for over 2 weeks now. Many of whom never knew Nolan personally, but have clearly been moved by his story regardless. And somewhere behind all of it, an investigation that hasn't paused for a single day of this, still working through a phone that hasn't been jointly examined yet, 2 autopsies that still haven't produced results, and a gap in Nolan's final hours that even a face-to-face conversation with his own mother hasn't been able to close. I want to know what you think Katie's account changes about this case, now that it's coming directly from her instead of through a relative's post on social media. Does an honest assumption, rather than a lie, change how you read the contradiction that's driven so much of this story from the very beginning? Tell me in the comments, because I think this is one of the more genuinely nuanced turns this case has taken, and I want to hear how you're reading it. We're going to stay on this story through the funeral itself, through both sets of autopsy results, and through whatever comes next as this case heads toward a grand jury referral. Subscribe if you want the facts the moment we have them, verified, and not a moment before. Monsters don't exist, but people capable of monstrous things do.